Good evening, everybody. It's with great pleasure that I'm able to welcome Joel Sanders to the UVA School of Architecture this evening. Joel is principal of JSA, Joel Sanders Architect, an architectural studio located in New York, and he is also the director of the post-professional program at Yale University School of Architecture, where he is a professor. Prior to joining the Yale faculty, he was director of the graduate program in architecture at Parsons, and he was also an assistant professor at Princeton. Joel's practice is a very interesting one. It traverses the spectrum from the speculative to the built, rethinks the relationship of the programmatic to the architectural by generating work that is responsive to the diversity and complexity of contemporary culture, perhaps more broadly put. The work also brings to the foreground issues of gender and the sensory within architecture, the relationship of materiality to media and technology, and the overlay and impact of the nature-culture dialectic in the creation of environments that are responsive. And Joel was also the author with Karen Van Langen of the NOG project, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And it gives you a sense of work, that he's done both at the kind of larger scale, but also at the interior scale. The firm's projects have received numerous design awards, including many AIA Progressive Architecture and Interior Design Awards, including the Interior Design Best of the Year Award, received for the UPenn Education Commons. And the work is also not just been exhibited, but also is in the collection of many museums. It's been exhibited at the Seoul National University Museum of Art, the MoMA in New York, the International Biennial for Architecture in Buenos Aires, Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, SF MoMA, Vitra, you name it. I'm sure Joel the work has either been there, exhibited there, or is in their collection. But he's also the editor of a book called Stud, Architectures of Masculinity, that was published by Princeton Architectural Press. He's a co-author with Diana Belmori of Groundwork Between Landscape and Architecture, and author of his own monograph, Joel Sanders' Writings and Projects, published by Monticelli Press. In his talk tonight, From Stud to Stalled, Social Equity in Public Restrooms, he'll present a design research project on what might seem to be a small and banal topic, the washroom, and use this in a way as a lens to embed, or through which to embed national controversies about gender issues, in particular transgender access to public restrooms as a point of departure to rethink what constitutes the public and their needs across age group, gender, dealing with issues of disability, religion. And the project in itself is a case study or an example of the way in which designers can explore in a very specific way the design consequences of social justice issues at a time, as we know, when human rights are under attack in this country and around the world in many different ways. So with that, I'll welcome Joel Sanders.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dean Berman, for that most generous introduction. And while I'm very lucky to visit many schools of architecture, invitations to UVA, a place I've been to many times, are at the top of my list. Why? Not only is it an opportunity to see the work of you, top-notch students and faculty, but in addition, it's an opportunity to reconnect with three of my favorite friends and colleagues, Isla Berman, Monat El-Kafif, and Karen Van Langen. So thanks so much, Isla, for the generous invitation. Okay, so both in my teaching and practice, over the course of my career, I've been exploring the intersection of architecture and gender identity. And at the risk of dating myself, when I began my career, I published a book 20 years ago in 1996 stud architectures of masculinity. And that has prompted me, that anniversary, the 20-year anniversary, prompted me to reflect on the evolution of my thinking about gender and space, which will be the theme of my talk this evening. And hindsight is 2020. Looking back, I realize now, it's something I'll talk about, that my perspective 20 years ago was that of a white, able-bodied gay man during the AIDS crisis. And today, my work is again shaped by national politics, some would say another crisis, this time controversies surrounding transgender access to public restrooms. And this social justice issue has led me to delve into two related fields that I was previously unfamiliar with, and I would recommend you might think about. One is transgender studies, and the second is disability studies. And these readings prompted me to adopt what I'll call, for lack of a better word, a trans-inclusive perspective that, as Isla mentioned, takes into consideration the needs of a spectrum of human users. I refer to them often as non-compliant or non-conforming bodies, people at different ages, genders, races, and disabilities. And strangely enough, this broader interest in the formation of gender identity in space has, over the past 20 years, brought me back over and over again to the consideration of an ordinary, everyday space that we take for granted, restrooms. And that's going to be the focus of my lecture this evening. And I'm fascinated by restrooms for a variety of reasons. Organized around water, bathrooms span multiple scales. They cater to the intimate needs of the flesh while relying on large-scale public infrastructures like plumbing and sanitation to work. They're encountered in every building type we design, and they are among the most labor-intensive and the most expensive rooms that we build. But what fascinates me most about bathrooms is that, contrary to the prevailing assumption that their design is determined by the ostensibly objective dictates of biology, of function, they are in fact places where a series of cultural, psychological, and technological forces converge. And so before I share with you some examples of my own bathroom research, I want to set the stage by offering you a brief cultural design history of Western bathrooms from antiquity until today. And this whirlwind history of washing and elimination is intended to underscore an important point. Again, the prevailing assumption is that bathroom practices in human history, again, are a function of technology and biology. I'm here to argue that they actually register changing cultural conceptions and often anxieties, deep-seated cultural anxieties about our corporal selves. And so to begin, the modern bathroom as we know it consolidates in one room two activities, washing and eliminating, that were separated from one another until the mass delivery of clean water was made possible by underground sewers and plumbing in the late 19th century. Over the course of human history, let's start talking about washing. Okay, so over the course of human history, washing, a practice which we today associate with hygiene, has come in and out of fashion. Design historians describe how from the Roman Empire to the Middle Ages, men and women washed in communal bathhouses. But for nearly 200 years, from roughly 1500 to 1750, there was a virtual moratorium against washing. Why? People infrequently bathe, fearing that waterborne diseases would kill them. Okay, and also, design historians show that bathrooms gradually became associated with houses of prostitution, houses of ill repute, and they were closed. Instead, the wealthy began washing isolated body parts, right, like Marie Antoinette, to mask offensive body odors, right? So let's fast forward to the late 19th century. As a result of advances in medical science, the advent of urban plumbing systems and the rise of a new industry, and this is important because I want to emphasize it's all about the intersection of economics, finance, manufacturing, cultural practices, okay? You get the advent of plumbing systems and the manufacture of new bathroom fixtures. And as a consequence, the reputation of bathing changed. It was redeemed now as a healthy practice, now conducted where? In private homes, by who? The upper and middle classes who could afford them. And if we fast forward now to the 20th century, right, you get mass market publications like House and Garden that are targeted to a new audience, who, suburban housewives, who counsel their readers to safeguard the health of their families by literally purchasing bathroom products and plumbing fixtures that would allow them to meet unprecedented standards of cleanliness. But not only hygienic, by the post-war period, bathrooms became associated with not only hygiene, but with pleasure. Publications like Playboy and Hollywood Films portrayed bathrooms as dens of seduction. And today, as we spend more and more time with our digital devices navigating virtual space, I would argue, and others would argue, that residential bathrooms have become more important than ever before. Why we have recast these home spas, which we're spending a lot of money on, statistically, okay, in renovations and new construction, conceived of now as retreats where we can reconnect with our alienated, embodied selves. Okay, so washing. Let's talk briefly about elimination, okay? I hope none of you are delicate in the audience. I'm going to refer to sort of shitting, and let's just go for it, okay? Or else, if you're offended, you can, well, whatever. Okay, but anyway, let's talk about elimination. The History of Shit, a book I recommend. It's written by French psychoanalyst Dominique Lepore. And he describes how, since the Middle Ages, excretion has elicited feelings of shame and disgust. And the feminist philosopher Julia Kristeva coined the term abjection to describe the discomfort induced when we come into contact with waste and bodily fluids. Blood, shit, and piss discharged from our orifices contradict the reassuring fiction that we are actually in control of our physical bodies, right? We believe that we're encased by this continuous human skin, a kind of controlling membrane that safely differentiates us, our inner selves, from the outside world. But as we know, skins are not continuous. They're porous, they sweat, and they're pierced by leaky orifices that discharge human waste. Reminders that, again, we are mortal beings made of flesh and blood. So let's quickly shift to modernism, okay? Art historians like Helen Molesworth describe how modern architects famously adored, championed plumbing. People like, especially Le Corbusier and Adolphe Loos, wrote whole essays about plumbing fixtures. Why? Because they considered this as a way, and this is to quote them, that modern man, M-A-N, okay, could triumph over abjection through waste management. Running water connected to mass-produced toilets and sinks eliminated the visual and olfactory evidence of waste. The impervious, white, sparkling surfaces of porcelain fixtures, rendered in white, right, as important to color associated with Christian purity, created for us the visual impression of cleanliness, okay? So this is a whole other, I could lead you to literature, but it's fascinating. They're not so hygienic. It's more the visual, reassuring sense that these porcelain fixtures are hygienic and safe. So, okay, let's move forward. So, as overdetermined sites that register our culture's ingrained ambivalence about the corporal body, bathrooms have been a seemingly inexhaustible topic of investigation in my own teaching and practice. And in my talk tonight, From Stud to Stalled, I'm going to share with you the evolution of my thinking about bathroom, my bathroom research. And why? Because I hope it's interesting for you, as it mirrors a shift in my thinking, but I think in sort of the thinking in our society about what I will refer to a shift from a kind of queer to, for lack of a better word, a trans-inclusive approach. Okay? Because I think we're thinking very different about what constitutes a gender identity today, and as a consequence, I think that has different implications for architecture. Okay? And again, to focus my talk, I'm going to focus on this supposedly inconsequential space, the bathroom. Okay, so my talk is going to be divided into two parts. Part one is called Queer Performativity, and there I'm going to briefly show you some of my early bathroom projects, generally residential projects, that I used at that time as a vehicle to explore, to now use some jargon, the construction of white queer masculinity, which I'll talk more about. Again, this was all research that I and a few of my colleagues were doing during the AIDS crisis. Okay, and so let's start there. So, STUD. The book invited architects, critics, and artists to explore the role architecture plays in the performance of male identity. And I use that word quite specifically, performance. So the book was divided, as you can see here, into 5 chapters, each devoted to an analysis of 4 everyday sites: home, homework, or offices, bathrooms, okay, gyms, and outings, or the street. And this kind of structure of the book was based on the premise that the performance of human identity takes place within architectural types or typologies. Ordinary structures associated with specific activities that distribute bodies, I and others would argue, within formulaic spatial configurations that we take for granted, but that powerfully shape the way in which humans interact with each other and the world around them. And then and now, my work is based on the conviction that typologies perpetuate the status quo. However, architects and users can decide to contest these norms and their attending sort of social values through appropriation and revision. And so, if STUD interrogated the role familiar building types play in the performance of masculinity, it borrowed an important concept of gender, again, as performance from gender theorist Judith Butler, who in her influential book, Gender Trouble, this was written in about 1990, argues that both masculinity and femininity are culturally constructed, learned modes of behavior. And Butler would, to use examples in her writing, would refer to the way, to drag queens. She would talk about the way drag queens exemplify how gender is enacted or performed, how by enlisting, the drag queen enlists culturally prescribed codes of bodily comportment. For example, through voice, through gesture, through fashion, through clothing, through makeup. And Butler's analysis led me to consider design's role, architecture's role, in the performance of gender, which relies not only on the materials or clothing or the materials that clad the body, but also, I would argue, to the designed environment, literally the cladding, the materials that we use to clad the exteriors and interiors we make. And we see this concept illustrated in Cindy Sherman's iconic untitled film stills, a series in which the artist photographs herself within carefully appointed domestic interiors. She uses costume props and mise-en-scène to impersonate different versions of womanhood as represented in classic Hollywood movies. So, for example, in this image, untitled film still number 11, the artist lies on a twin bed in a tiny claustrophobic bedroom. Her blonde curls, lace dress and handkerchief, floral bedspread and carpet, and French provincial nightstands all create a harmonized web of visual cues that signify to us that this is a portrait of a rather lonely, forlorn, probably unmarried, middle-class, cisgendered white woman. And Sherman's recumbent figure, shot from above, establishes a flickering figure-ground relationship with a patterned background, underscoring the interdependence of human identity, body, and domestic space. And I just want to note that while my talk is focusing on gender, what I really want to take away for you is that the designed environment has the capacity to signify not only gender, but again, different factors that constitute who we are. Like in this case, that Cindy Sherman is a white, cisgendered, probably middle-class woman. So we can, through clothing and fashion and design, construct our identities, and we read other people's identities. So Studd devoted a chapter to analyzing an architectural type central to the construction of maleness, the men's room, revealing it to be a theater of heterosexual anxiety, to quote one author, Lee Edelman, who wrote an essay which has become actually a classic I'm proud of. I didn't write it, but I commissioned it, okay? And in which Lee describes how the configuration of the men's room, its walls and interiors, distribute eyes and bodies in ways that actually initiate, bring into being the very activities and fears that structure men's room architecture, or that the structure of men's room architecture, was designed to ward off. Okay, so for example, and what are those anxieties? Masculine inadequacy and same-sex desire. So for example, the flimsy partition between urinals, so they're designed to prohibit looking at one's neighbor peeing, often trigger the anxious feelings. Again, they were designed to prohibit. Likewise, sitting sequestered in a flimsy toilet stall in close proximity to other men defecating, sometimes, or actually can call attention to this vulnerable orifice, the male anus, that it was designed to shelter, if you agree with Lee, and I do. For some men, okay, he would argue, something as innocent as a bathroom stall elicits threatening feelings of abjection, pleasure, and desire. And so during the 1990s, at my office, JSA, we applied insights derived from Studd's analysis of men's rooms to what was at that time my recently launched professional practice. And quite frankly, I was trying to make do with nothing. We were getting these little tiny, I'm not like sort of rich and well-connected, so we were getting some of our early projects, sort of small restroom projects. And there was a kind of interesting, I just want to mention that this wonderful sort of confluence of sort of theory, teaching, and practice, and I became very interested in bathrooms. Okay? And many of our first projects were residential renovation projects and commissioned some by gay clients. And we drew inspiration from the way gay men appropriated standard restroom elements and used them in subversive ways to facilitate the choreography of cruising or gay male coupling. For example, gay men took advantage of bathroom mirrors as well as the gaps, cracks, and holes in bathroom partitions to promote visual and visual exchanges between bodies in men's rooms at a time when our culture prohibited them from meeting out openly in public space. And so one project inspired by the restroom was this one. It's the Vitali Loft. It was designed in 1999. We called it a bachelor pad. It was designed, and it provided us for the opportunity to transpose these sort of design tactics of men's rooms for residential applications, and to think in particular about residential, not only bathrooms and kitchens. So as many of you know, okay, if you've worked in offices on multi-level residential buildings, apartment layouts are often dictated by the location of plumbing stacks. And they often lead to configurations where kitchens and bathrooms are literally back-to-back, adjacent to one another. However, traditional notions of domestic privacy and propriety dictate, or they did dictate, at least back 20 years ago, that these spaces, that both, and that's what I think is important, both spaces cater to the needs of the flesh, to the biological body. What do we do in these rooms? We eat, we wash, we eliminate them. And so, but strangely enough, although back-to-back because of plumbing stacks, they're often cordoned off from one another. So at the Vitali Loft in this project, we chose to celebrate rather than conceal their spatial proximity by consolidating both functions in this freestanding concrete plumbing island. A translucent glass panel bisects the island, screening the kitchen from the master bathroom. which we now treated as an open step platform that opens directly to the master bedroom. The glass partition is intersected by a continuous waterproof membrane that connects these normally isolated functions, allowing them to freely overlap. Now our clients, either alone or with friends, can dine, lounge, or bathe between these two spaces. And our objective was to treat the flowing concrete surface and the translucent partition as a device to overturn what was then a kind of taboo against male spectacle. We tried to destabilize the active-passive, subject-object, male-female binaries that inform conventional domestic design or domestic visuality. And we wanted to dissolve, again, these traditional boundaries between bedrooms, bathrooms, and kitchens, treating them as intercommunicating sites dedicated to embodied pleasure. Now, men as well as women are both subject and object of the gaze. And keep in mind that back in 1999, these translucent bathroom walls, as well as media images of male beefcake were not commonplace then as they are today. And this project, when we did it, was widely published. It was considered pretty radical, and it was first published where each magazine would airbrush out for either the man or the woman. There were very few people at that time, believe it or not, that would show the men and women together. And at that time, also, we got a lot of kind of angry, or let's say skeptical feedback from readers who commented that this project would only appeal to, let's say, deviants, like gay men and exhibitionists. And I think it's interesting to know that 15 years later, these ideas have become completely mainstream. Go to any boutique hotel and you'll see bathrooms like this. And also in my own practice, our residential clients, many of them quite well-heeled, no matter their identities or preferences, regularly ask us to incorporate once novel design features like reconfigurable bathroom walls and beds, as well as these switch light bathrooms, glass, as we did in this Manhattan duplex, just five or 6 years ago, for a couple with 4 children. This is what they wanted. Times change. And I guess I just want to kind of emphasize one of the takeaways, that one of the things I think is at least interesting for me, and I hope for you, is that an outsider perspective, let's say in this case a queer perspective, we were supposedly thinking about the needs of queer people. A lot of these ideas lead to kind of just out-of-the-box thinking that have a much broader application and that can be applied, or discoveries that can be applied in a much broader way. So, 2 years ago, I'm fast-forwarding to now, okay? So 2 years ago, the convergence of my professional practice coincided with national debates sparked by the moral panic surrounding the question of transgender access to public restrooms. And these events led me to return to the public restroom as a locus of cultural anxiety, but this time as seen through a transgender or trans-inclusive lens. In 2015, my office was invited to design the New York City headquarters for GLISTEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to making schools safe and nurturing environments for grades K through 12. And building codes, coupled with an uncooperative landlord, prevented us from implementing all-gender or gender-neutral bathrooms that were central to our clients' mission. And these project-specific frustrations, we tried, but we couldn't do it, okay? My client was very upset. And so these frustrations coincided with my interest in current events. And at that time, there was a lot of mainstream media coverage of national debates triggered again by the threat of transgender people of using public restrooms. And many of you in the room might be familiar with these. And these bathroom politics, again, led me to immerse myself in transgender studies, I mentioned that before, and to rekindle a dialogue with Susan Stryker, a woman I had known for many years but hadn't been in contact with. And Susan has become, I would say, the leading transgender historian, theorist, and activist. And I called her up and I said, Susan, what's going on? Let's talk about the design implications of this social justice issue. So it began as a series of conversations, seminars at Yale, and then we received an invitation to write an essay for an academic journal, the South Atlantic Quarterly, published by Duke. And out of this essay, it's mushroomed into Stalled, which has become kind of a full-time, almost full-time project in my office, which does not make my staff very happy because I should be spending time on money-making projects instead of this. But I've sort of become very, very obsessed with this. And the project is a design research project, which is, in a nutshell, dedicated to coming up with best practice guidelines and developing prototypes for inclusive public restrooms. Okay. So again, I just want to say that Stalled is the product of the coincidental convergence of my academic, theoretical, and professional interests. I say this because I think many of you in the audience probably have had the same thing. I think those are the great moments, at least for me, as a designer, as a teacher, when the personal and the professional and the theoretical come together, and the political. And so what also has become sort of funny to me is that gender and architecture, a field that I thought I just sort of was over with, has now led me back 20 years later to focusing again on architecture, gender identity, and LGBTQ issues. So let's talk about Stalled. My work with Susan, we began by situating national debates within a social and political context. We quickly realized that bathroom controversies are not new. At different moments in American history, the public restroom has been a crucible that has registered social anxieties triggered by the threat of a series of marginalized groups from entering into mainstream society. Historical milestones include debates sparked by the introduction of the first ladies' rooms in around 1880 in Massachusetts. Why? To accommodate women entering the workplace. The fight to abolish segregated colored bathrooms by the civil rights movements during the 1950s and 60s. The fear of contamination posed by gay men using public lavatories during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. And the pressure exerted by the disability rights movement, a coalition formed by grassroots activists that led to something great, the passing of the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, in 1990. And what I want to emphasize is that in each instance, the public restroom, we would argue by virtue of it being a physical, tangible, everyday space, had the power to transform an abstract concern into a tangible peril, having the power to conjure nightmarish scenarios that compel ostensibly normal citizens to physically interact with abnormal people that society prefers to render invisible. And today, public restrooms are again a contested site, this time sparked by the specter of allowing a new constituency, transgender individuals, to gain access to them and to the public realm. And so to talk briefly about bathroom politics, it's complicated, but in a nutshell, since 2013, there have been a series of attempts to try to deny trans people access, and this is important by law, to the bathroom assigned to the gender which is on their birth certificate, as opposed to the bathroom that corresponds to the gender that they identify with. And there are too many cases to list here, but two important ones were Campaign for Houston, in which case the mayor of Houston, who in fact was a gay woman, wanted to just demonstrate that Houston was an inclusive space, and the alt-right overturned a general non-discrimination clause by singling out transgender individuals. I'll talk more about that later. Other measures that got a lot of attention were focused on North Carolina's House Bill 2 that sparked more than 24 other states basically protest against Title IX protections that the Obama administration had put into place. Right? He said that trans people should have access in public buildings and government buildings to the restrooms from which they identified with. Okay? And all of this seemed to be kind of moving forward. There was a Supreme Court case that was going to be heard, and the Trump administration was elected, and that has all been squashed. Okay, and that case is an important one. It was the Gavin Grimm case, and it was based on a trans male high school student, you've probably heard about it, who was relegated to using a janitor's closet to get undressed at the gym, and it was that case, the right to be included with others, that led to this case to be being heard before the Supreme Court case. No longer, at least for now. But Susan and I were looking at all this literature. There's so much stuff in the papers. But on both sides of the debate, we realized that everyone was framing this as a matter of safety. While advocates of transgender access to restrooms cited high rates of violence that were faced by trans people, and in particular, it's trans women of color who are, statistically we know, continuously threatened or often threatened in restrooms. However, what kind of interested us as well is the claims of the alt-right. They said safety was the issue. Why? Because they said they portrayed inaccurately trans women as predatory men masquerading in dresses who stalked wives and daughters in women's rooms. And these are the posters. And it was under those grounds that these bathroom bills were defeated. Okay? And there's no evidence ever of this ever happening. Okay? And it's a complete misunderstanding of what a trans person is. So Susan and I were scratching our heads and trying to say, wait a second, beneath this unsubstantiated fear, something else is going on. And we argued in our essay that bathrooms elicit these long-standing societal anxieties about human embodiment that, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that bathrooms have historically harbored. And these include misogyny, homophobia, as well as objection. And something I'll talk more about, disability, okay, that fact that of embodied difference, right? That all of us are not the same size and have the same ability to, the same mental and physical abilities. However, Susan and I argue that an even deeper threat that's provoked by the provocation of trans access to restrooms is, for lack of a better word, gender fluidity. The idea that trans people call into question the presumption that one's anatomy is destiny. How? By demonstrating that there are multiple ways of expressing one's gender identity, independent from one's biological sex, and in ways that don't conform to the gender binary, male and female segregated restrooms, that bathrooms perpetuate through spatial segregation. Okay? So our thinking was informed by one of the key insights of transgender theory. That is the complexity of not only gender identity, but all human identity. And I think it's worthwhile just to give you a little sort of transgender theory 101, okay? 20 years ago, queer theory was predicated on what trans theorists today called cis-embodiment, in which the category of physical sex, okay, that if one has a penis and a vagina, that determined one's sex and one's gender, male, female. And that these were stable reference against which a queer deviation of gender signification would play. So to put it in very simply, in other words, people who identify as gay or lesbian are biological men and women, right, who happen to prefer having sex with members of their own sex. However, trans theory argues, on the other hand, that both sex and gender and sexual orientation are malleable demonstrating that there are multiple ways of living one's gender independent from biological sex and sexual orientation. And so as Susan has written, to quote her, human culture has created many ways of putting together bodies, subjectivities, social roles, and kinship structures. That it's a vast apparatus for producing personhood that we call gender. And so to use a kind of mathematical analogy, if gay lesbian is a one variable equation that equates physical sex and sexual orientation, then transness is a multivariable equation that destables and scrambles the categories of physical sex, gender identity, and desire. A few examples: intersex people. These are people born with genitals and chromosomes that are not typically male or female. Okay? They're just one example of people who defy the commonly held belief that we are born either biologically male or female. Another example, and this is very important, is that gender identity is perceived of as a spectrum. Non-binary people like genderqueer, pangender, and agender individuals, right, refuse stable gender categories altogether. For example, one's sexual identity and expression is not necessarily tied to one's sexual orientation. For example, my colleague again, Susan, is a trans woman who prefers to sleep with women. She has a female partner, and she identifies herself as a lesbian, actually as a trans butch lesbian. So I'm just saying that there are multiple variables, multiple ways of how we express who and what we are, independent of anatomy. Okay? And the point really is that architecture, okay, I think that's what's important to have that discussion here. Something as simple as a sex-segregated restroom that we take for granted naturalizes and makes us take for granted in an unquestioned way this association between identity, gender, and human anatomy. So, STALD, who are we? We're a cross-disciplinary research team consisting again of myself, a trans theorist, Susan Stryker, and also a legal scholar, Terry Kogan. And what we're trying to do is, and in addition, we have a fourth member of our team, Cumel Arroyo, who is himself disabled, who is the policy analysis at the Department of Transportation in New York for making, at the Department of Transportation for Disability. So STALD, what we're trying to do is shift the terms of the debate, okay? First, what distinguishes us from the considerable body of work that's already been generated by scholars, lawyers, activists, and the media that cover this issue? First is that unlike anybody else that I've seen, okay, we are arguing that this is also an architectural problem, okay? We think that public restrooms are a design problem, a social justice issue that can be solved with innovative architectural solutions. Second, unlike most accounts that frame bathroom design as a question, as I talked about, of either function or safety, our team adopts a cross-disciplinary approach and proposes design solutions that take into account what I was talking about earlier, that bathrooms are cultural, political, and infrastructural dimensions of a complex problem. And that third, our cross-disciplinary perspective allows us to challenge the accepted bathroom norm of the binary sex-segregated restroom as an inevitability that answers to the universal need for privacy based on anatomical difference. And one of our members, Terry Kogan, was actually invited to write the epistle brief that was heard before the Supreme Court. So he brings to us an in-depth legal perspective, and I just want to emphasize too that, we often in architecture schools, we say, if you get your license, you need to learn about building codes, right? But we rarely, we pay lip service to that, but it's really enacted. And one of the things that I think that's, to me at least, interesting about this issue, it's like a living, breathing example, is that we designers can't solve issues alone. We have to collaborate and join forces, in particular with people like Terry, who are involved with the way in which building codes as well as laws really sort of shape the way we practice as architecture, and as a consequence, social equity. Okay, so just to talk a few of these examples. So realizing that the sex-segregated restroom is a culturally and historically contingent architectural type freed us to critique the generally accepted solution when people are interested in actually implementing all-gender bathrooms. And how do they do this? They supplement sex-segregated facilities, right, by adding a single occupancy room, often with wheelchair access, that's labeled gender neutral. In other words, if there's an existing single unit ADA stall, you change the label and you call it all gender. And incidentally, up until recently, that was against the law, but it's recently the building code has been amended to allow for the single unit to take place. And we argue that while better than nothing, that this approach is not good enough. Why? Because it stigmatizes non-conforming individuals. Not only trans people, who might not necessarily identify with either man or female, okay, but also the disabled, for example. How? By isolating them, by segregating them from other people, okay. And what we're advocating is an alternative model that does away with gender-segregated facilities entirely. And how? The other thing we want to abolish is focusing on the stall, okay? I refer to them as these American-style stalls with these revealing gaps at the floor, at the ceiling, and doors that compromise visual privacy. They're standard here, but hop on a plane, go to Europe, go to Canada, and you see floor-to-ceiling privacy stalls that are favored by the transgender community. So what we're advocating is an alternative model that treats the public restroom as a single open space, again, equipped with these European-style, fully enclosed floor-to-ceiling doors that ensure visual privacy. And this solution, we think, has several advantages. Okay, first, that gender non-conforming people need not any longer choose between options that don't align with their identities. By consolidating a number of people in one room rather than twos, there are potentially more eyes to monitor it, reducing the risk of restroom harassment. So we're arguing that these are, in fact, safer, more eyes on the street. And again, would help not only transgender people who are victimized in restrooms, but many people, right, who face this dilemma. However, an obstacle to be overcome is that this multi-user type that we're advocating requires a variance. And it's not hard to get, but it requires a variance. And so our team, spearheaded by Terry Kogan, is spearheading an initiative to amend the International Plumbing Code, the IPC. And this is the model code that governs most construction in the US. And it would be to amend it to give people the ability to choose between the conventional solution or a multi-unit solution, both in new construction and in retrofits. And right now, we're working with, we've gotten the AIA, the New York chapter of the AIA to kind of endorse our project officially, and we're working with them and the national AIA, hopefully to lobby the International Plumbing Council and to change the building codes when they meet again in a couple of years. But the other thing that we're advertising, not advertising, but that is important to us, is that the multi-user type not only meets the needs of trans people, but also a wide range of, for lack of a better word, a wide range of non-normative bodies that are traditionally neglected in public restrooms. Unlike most bathroom solutions that focus on gender, our work attempts to cast a wider net. How? By developing inclusive guidelines that take into consideration all people of different ages, genders, religions, and disabilities. And fourth, I want to say that, I said this before, that we believe that by addressing the specific needs of non-conforming bodies, that this can be a catalyst for creativity, that it might yield innovative design solutions that can enhance the way all of us use public space. So I just want to show you a couple examples before I close of some of the prototypes we're developing. We are collaborating with Gallaudet University, a school, many of you might have heard of it. It's a school for the deaf. that has been meeting the educational needs of non-conforming bodies, people who are hard of hearing, since it was founded by Abraham Lincoln. And we are lucky enough to have two fantastic clients, pictured here, Hansel Bauman and Liz Brading. And we're also working with the faculty committee to create inclusive restrooms in a renovation that's going on now in their sports facility called the Field House, pictured here. And so on the upper level of the sports facility, we are working with constraints imposed by the modest footprint of an existing men's and women's room, working to retrofit the typical sex-segregated bathroom into a multi-user facility. And both my office and our client considered this collaboration as a kind of case study that we hope will yield a design principles that could be applied to similar institutions for retrofit projects. So here it is shown here. And as you can see, the kind of principle is that we are, well, let me go on here. So what we're doing, we're specifying durable yet economic materials to prove that multi-stall upgrades are no more expensive than a traditional renovation. That's usually the first argument. This is going to cost a lot more money. We, in fact, did detailed designs for both that were gave them to a cost estimator. We have like line items, and we show that it's almost incrementally different to kind of do a typical renovation or this back-to-back. But we also wanted to underscore how the process of addressing a practical need can also have unexpected architectural outcomes that can improve the lives of buildings. So basically, it goes like this, that conceiving of the stall as the unit of privacy allowed us to eliminate the wall that previously divided the bathroom from long, monotonous corridors that are typical in buildings. And instead, we are trying to create a more porous spatial relationship between the bathroom corridor and what we're now activating as an open lounge. So as you can see here, people come around the corner. They're invited to kind of fluidly enter the bathroom. The hallway is animated by this lounge lobby space. There are a series of stalls in the back. And grooming is a kind of communal space that is really off the main corridor. Okay? So get rid of these sort of closed, sort of boring spaces. And working with, we also discovered that this corridor was actually the introduction to the physical phys ed department. And so we used it as an opportunity not only to kind of change this renovation of the bathrooms, but to animate this corridor. And we found these kind of crenellations between columns, and we're activating it to create these sort of niches. And one of the things that's we found fascinating and our client had generated is a whole manual of, Cancel refers to it as deaf space. So for example, that people who are hard of hearing need to have their sign language needs to be silhouetted. White walls don't work, okay? And they've done studies in that their colors, particularly blue, is considered a color that would make a kind of appropriate backdrop, okay? I mean, I never thought about this when I designed or choose colors. The other thing, too, is that furniture that allows face-to-face seating for deaf people who want a hand signal is really important, okay? So these were some of the factors. I'm not going to talk about it much now, but another related issue is the problem of transgender or all-gender locker rooms. And we're creating 2 inclusive public restrooms on the lower level of the sports facility. And again, we thought that this sort of modest project, okay, was an opportunity to rethink the kind of lower level entry, and we kind of created a kind of inclusive sort of lobby, okay. The message would be we're inclusive, and what we have are lockers, okay, where in countries like Canada and Europe, this is not, Isla's Canadian, so she could maybe speak to this, okay, but just Google Canada, okay, and you'll see all these examples, okay, but it's not uncommon where you see these hallways that are activated. They're lockers, activate the hallways, people take off their heavy belongings, put them in lockers, and then you can then go into a smaller room and just take off your lighter wear, put them on hooks, okay? But what we were trying to do, again, I work with universities. I'm working with a lot of them right now who are all tackling with this issue, including MIT, University of Pennsylvania, Princeton, Vassar, Yale. There's like 10 of them now, okay? What we're finding is that people call us and say, we have a problem, trans, bathrooms, gender. And we say, no, don't just focus there. We need to think, again, much more broadly about the needs of differently embodied people. So one of the things that we're sort of proud of that we can show in this diagram, that we've come up with this prototype that's not only for trans, it's for ADA, but we've also, for example, discovered that a huge issue for many institutions, perhaps this one, is religion. Okay, what about Orthodox Jews, or in particular Muslims, who perform daily bathroom rituals that they're asked to clean ritually from their head to their feet? If you Google this, right, you'll see images of Muslim men looking the other way and having to resort to putting their feet in normal basins, okay? And so what we're doing here is that this shower is an ADA shower, and it's equipped with a flip-down seat, okay, that also could have a hose that could also allow for Muslims to use and to perform bathroom evolutions. Another thing that we found through research is that a lot of people implement different kinds of medical procedures, syringes and things, okay? They want dry counters. We've learned from working with QML, or disability specialist who was himself in a wheelchair, that traditional sinks, okay, drench him and others entirely because they just splash and pour water, okay, over somebody who's sitting there, okay? So in other words, we don't have time to go through it all, but when you really begin to think about what are the needs of differently embodied individuals, we're trying to see, is there a way of creating a shared space where their different needs can be met? Okay, so in addition to coming up with economical prototypes for new and renovation projects like Gallaudet, we've also developing speculative prototypes for a generic airport restroom. And why did we pick an airport? Well, it's a high-volume, mixed-use public space where people spend a lot of time thinking about their bodies and addressing the needs of their bodies. And so our idea here is we first began researching typical airport layouts. This one is taken from this guidebook. Again, often these male-female configurations, back-to-back, as you can see above. And working with those same dimensions, we added a little bit more space on either side. We thought, let's reconceive of this space as this is meant to be the airport concourse, okay? And so the idea is to, let me just go back, I'm sorry, to rethink the bathroom as a public precinct, an agora, which is a kind of porous extension of the concourse, and it's divided into these 3 activity zones that are dedicated to the universal activities that take place in bathrooms: grooming, washing, and eliminating, as you can see here. So quickly to take you through it. And also, we developed this design methodology diagram that reflects, again, this kind of thinking. And the idea here is that our research is a 2-step process. And here we're building on something that's an important field that many of you might know about, what's often referred to as inclusive design. Okay? Not inclusive design, universal design. Okay? And the idea is that you begin by doing design research, because there's a lot of work out there where people have responsibly looked at how to deal with issues of gender, of age, of disability, of religion, of psychology. But what we found, that they tend to be a kind of neo-functionalist approach that creates fixtures that are very specific to different people's needs. That's great. But that would lead to like the biggest bathroom in the world, okay, if you were going to sort of consolidate all of these needs. So our thinking is sharing, okay? How to sort of consolidate these overlapping sort of needs to kind of create a more compact public space. But this is really the key, because what we really care about is mixing, okay? That we believe that, again, a society, a democratic society, tolerates embodied difference, not tolerates, but welcomes and embraces mixing and human difference. And the other thing that we found is that when we started to do this kind of design analysis, we found that there were kind of 3 factors that guided our decisions. And the first is wayfinding. Wayfinding is particularly important. How to devise systems that don't only rely on signs to direct people. And in this case, again, it's how to use color, texture, and even dramatic lighting in lieu of signage or in addition to signage to help people with physical and sensory disabilities navigate through public space. The second is ergonomics, integrating shared elements like counters at different heights that encourage mixing. And three, culture, making design decisions that enhance physical and psychological well-being to counteract culturally learned feelings of embarrassment and shame that bathrooms typically evoke in users. And so the three stations, grooming, we thought of the grooming station immediately adjacent to the airport concourse. It's two-sided. On the outside, it would have sort of display information, okay, airport information. But on the interior wall, it would have this multi-level counter, again, at different heights, to allow people of different embodiments and ages to groom. Those who want privacy can retreat into these curtained alcoves for breastfeeding. By the way, women's rooms or mothers' rooms have become increasingly important. Administering medical procedures I talked about, like insulin injections. Another thing that we're finding, and actually we're being hired by a progressive company, is to address the need for prayer rooms, places for meditation and prayer for people of different religions. And this is even at workspaces, private offices. Washing. Here we're rethinking the traditional sinks with this communal washing station that meets, again, the needs of adults, children, and people in wheelchairs. And the idea is that inset floor lights would indicate the location of motion-activated faucets that are inset into a wall that allows a stream of water to flow into this inclined splash plane that replaces those nasty sinks I talked about earlier. And this kind of inclined splash plane is at different heights. We thought it could be an animated feature, but it's at different ergonomic heights to meet the needs of different forms of embodiment. The water is then collected and remediated in this planter before being recycled. So we wanted this also to be a project that would sort of be, teach people about another issue I haven't focused on, but which is huge in bathroom, which is ecology and water conservation and preservation. And then lastly, the elimination station. The rear of the facility consolidates these bathroom stalls. They're of different sizes. Caregiving is a huge issue, okay? And I think one of the main assets of these inclusive restrooms. I just visited my 93-year-old mother. Now I can take her, into the ladies' room, or Josh Denneberg complains that he can't take his infant daughter into restrooms. So there are many kind of ways in which these prototypes could meet the needs of different family structures, okay? And the idea here is a little more expensive. The idea that there would be these translucent blue glass. If there was a vacant bathroom, there would be a light, it would go off, you'd sit, and we were thinking about having this one-way mirror that would allow people inside to sort of survey what's happening outside. Because another thing that we've learned, or people have learned, that people feel very kind of vulnerable sequestered in a stall. So this kind of two-way surveillance was important. And also, our hope would be that, again, something you find in Europe, that all of these stalls would have either low flush or composting toilets that would treat human waste through managed aerobic decomposition. So as users circulate in this section from the concourse, the outermost grooming station to the innermost toilet wall, our hope is that they would experience a kind of new, a more vibrant environment, a multi-sensory gradient that would take them from public to private, from open to closed, from smooth to coarse, from dry to wet, from acoustically reverberant to sound absorptive, and also from bright ambient lighting to sort of dramatic lighting. That was also a form of wayfinding. So in short, gender fluidity, we hope, would yield spatial fluidity, opening up new formal and material possibilities for the design of equitable public space. So just want to end my presentation with a few concluding remarks. At the very least, I hope that my talk will encourage you to think twice the next time you use a restroom. Bathrooms, again, are a site of social exchange where social, psychological, technological, and ecological forces converge. 2, trans theory, as said, has prompted me to re-examine some of the themes that informed my earlier work with a more inclusive perspective. Concepts like performativity and typology, which I considered from a queer viewpoint two decades ago, I think are relevant again today. However, again, hindsight is 20/20, and looking back, and it's revealed to me the limitations of my own work that, again, were complicit in architecture's tendency to presume, and this is important. Who do we presume? Who is the spectator that we typically design for? A Western, able-bodied, white, cisgendered man, now a woman. And this is indoctrinated in these seemingly innocent illustrations and design standards, like time-saver standards, these eviscerated bodies based on these ergonomic dimensions that are encoded in the way we build. Okay? And so public restrooms are but one example of how the design of everyday architectural space have been based on ergonomic standards, again, derived from able-bodied, cisgendered white males, which are based on problematic social assumptions about what is normal and what is abnormal. Okay? And these supposedly innocent standards, I mean, you want to leave now, but I could give you a whole other talk on this, but that if you look back in history, these innocent building codes, these design standards, have since the 19th century, historians have demonstrated, inhibited a series of marginalized communities, again, from gaining access to public space. Okay? When the government wanted to exclude women, African Americans, gay men, immigrants, and the transgender community, every time the argument was that these people are somehow inferior, okay, that they're abnormal and they're deviant, and that was grounds for exclusion. And these arguments, we thought we were way beyond them, but they're coming up again today. Open the newspaper, particularly when it comes to immigration. Okay, and also, I think the other takeaway is, again, that this look into two fields I was unaware of, trans studies, disability studies, have encouraged me to broaden my formerly queer perspective with design strategies that accommodate the needs, again, of a wide spectrum of bodies. People whose bodies deviate from the norm because of age, gender, religion, or disability. In other words, my partner, Susan, who's trans, said that the spotlight on trans, for better for worse, is merely a platform for a much broader message, which is embodied inclusivity. We need to think beyond gender. And again, we need to think that trans theory teaches us that there's a multiplicity of ways of expressing embodied difference, okay? And we need to think as architects, as we design for high performance spaces that allow people to do different kinds of, assume different roles, different identities in public space, to think of the multiplicity of variables and factors, including gender, that constitute who we are, okay, and how we interact with each other. Another thing that's kind of happened that we hope to work more on is that if in, let's say, that early work I showed you, was very focused on sort of, kind of bachelor pads that spoke to a kind of a gay male audience, okay? Trans theory, I think, underscores the need that we need to abolish sex-segregated buildings altogether. Not only restrooms, but dormitories, prisons, fire stations, and military compounds. Building types that all privilege gender as the definition of human identity, and as a consequence, dictate the configurations of everyday space, okay? I want you to come away from this talk, at least to think about that gender need no longer be calculated, or that gender is only one aspect of a much more complex calculation that we as designers think about when we consider the way the design environment is built. Okay? And lastly, that trans theory can be a catalyst for creativity, allowing us to generate unforeseen formal solutions that have the potential to transform the way all of us experience the built environment. And also, I just want to say again that bathrooms are a case study. While important in their own right, there's a lot of discussion about them right now. this is about generating a larger conversation about the relationship between environmental design, the human body, and social equity. And to this end, this is a little plug for a conference on April 6th and 7th at Yale. Susan and I are convening a conference. It's called Non-Compliant Bodies, Social Equity in Public Space. And what we're trying to do is assemble not only designers, but theorists, administrators, legal scholars, from different disciplines to join forces to interrogate now 3 building types. Not only restrooms, but we're looking at museums and urban streets. And we're going to look at them through the lens of race, gender, and disability. Our goal is to look back to move forward. And the idea is first we're going to interrogate how the kind of histories of all these building types have been used, they're designed to marginalize and exclude, and how we can join forces to think differently, to imagine and envision alternative futures that again allow this kind of mixing of different forms of human embodiment. And needless to say, I should say the last session is devoted to the street, and needless to say the panel is going to focus, or at least part of their discussion is going to talk about Charlottesville and make reference to the recent violence that erupted, unfortunately, here in the downtown over the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee in Emancipation Square. This idea of public space is a source of oppression, but also of resistance. Sorry, this was the slide I meant to show you about that. And I hope that this talk, as well as the conference, will be a call to arms. The national debates surrounding transgender bathrooms and Civil War monuments are just 2 examples of the way the civil liberties of non-compliant bodies, women, blacks, Muslims, immigrants, and the LGBT community, to name just a few, are imperiled both in this country and around the world. In other words, this is a political issue with concrete architectural ramifications. We, architects and designers, need to step up to the plate. We need to explore the design consequences of these urgent social justice issues. We need to become aware of our own complicity by no longer turning a blind eye to the way the seemingly innocent conventions of architecture reproduce problematic cultural assumptions about standard and deviant bodies. Instead, we need to form coalitions, right, and collaborations with activists, lawyers, code experts, engineers, graphic designers, ecologists, and to form coalitions that would enable a new design approach that allows, again, a broad range of differently embodied people of different ages, genders, religions, and disabilities, to productively interact with one another in public and private space. So thank you very much. Yeah, happy to take questions if anybody has any.
Hey, thanks so much for coming to UVA.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is a space where there are a lot of very tense sphincters, so I'm glad that you were able to come enlighten us. So I have a question for you, especially about what you said about the problematic nature of having a single, gender-neutral bathroom that's designated for all of the different other bodies, and then relying on the 2 male and female restrooms next to that. And I'm just curious to know what your feelings are about the importance of having a male-specific or female-specific bathroom, because I just wonder, for trans people, the rite of passage that it might be to enter a male-specific or female-specific restroom, and the important gendered space that a women's room can be for socializing between women. I think that this is something that I think about in design. When is the middle path become an averaging of design instead of an inclusion of many different designs. So, yeah, I was just curious to know your thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and it's come up in different forms before, so I'll try do my best to answer. And first is to say that the single unit solution is a good solution, but I wouldn't say a good solution, but is better than nothing. Okay, but I think it's a good start. And as I said to you before, I think the problem is, again, it stigmatizes people of different embodiments. But I think it's also really important to, I'm just going to say it again, that I think there's a misconception that I sort of believed before learning more about transgender people, that the kind of, that not every transgender person identifies as man or woman. I think Caitlyn Jenner is like an example, I think, of that. And that really that gender is a spectrum, and that it's really that sex-segregated restrooms force transgender people, or let's say gender non-conforming people, to identify with two terms that they're not, okay? But also, and I think I'm repeating this again, that I think that this sex-segregated restroom naturalizes and reinforces spatially in us, right? Inculcates this idea that we need to disprove and relearn if we're going to be in a society that embraces complexity, okay? But back to, I think, which is maybe your question. Some people have said, it's usually, you're being very polite, but other people have often been hostile. So, for example, women in the audience have said, Mr. Sanders, your new typology is going to no longer allow women's room to function as they have, as sort of sacred enclaves where women can socialize and talk to one another. That's an argument. Gay men throw eggs at me and say, Joel, you're advocating, eliminating, one of the sort of central sort of cultural types, the bathroom as a place of sort of sexual exchange. And my answer to it is a couple of things. One is that the bathrooms that we're advocating, if there's enough money, need to have a series of private stalls of different sizes that could allow people to congregate. Two, okay, I think, yeah, well, no, but for different reasons. Also, there are other building types or other ways of accommodating. In other words, we need safe spaces where people, different kinds of people, men, women, people of different religions, can choose to socialize and be intimate with one another. I just don't think it has to be the men's room, okay? Three, all right, people talk about, like the virtues of the sex-segregated men's and women's rooms. But again, my politics I'm wearing on my sleeve. But Donald Trump, the whole national conversation we had about locker room talk. In other words, that single sex-segregated spaces generate and encourage really problematic forms of social behavior as well as positive ones. So we're not trying to eradicate them, but we can find different forms of accommodation. They don't necessarily need to take place in bathrooms. And then my last answer, this wasn't the question, but I will say it, is that it's a trade-off, okay? I think we're living in a moment in history where the internet, okay, the virtual public realm is forming new kinds of sort of public spaces where people like gay people meet one another. In other words, I don't think there's the same need, okay, that, let's say, the bathroom had in the 1950s for gay men as it does now. So it is a trade-off, okay? And I think that we need to err. It gets back to what we were talking about before, not to focus so much on gender as the issue. And my problem with even clients who are calling us up to help, they think the issue is gender. And I guess the message I'm trying to say is that we need to shift the conversation to different forms of embodiment. And I think the other thing that's really important, I'm talking too much and I'm being maybe too preachy, okay, and I'm sorry. But identity politics, I mean, you're here at universities. You can take courses in race. You could take courses in gender. You could take queer studies. You can take disability studies. Those are important. But I think what we're talking about is what many, also, I think, forward-thinking leaders of the field are. It's often referred to as intersectionality, right? That you can't think gender without thinking race, without thinking disability, right? that they inform how we inhabit the world, and they have architectural consequences. And I think that the space like why I think architecture is the place that's so important in this is that that space is the medium of mixing. And that I think in the end of the day, it's all about creating spaces that allow people of different forms of embodiment, different kinds of difference to mix. And that's what I think that we can do. And I think in the process, we need to form coalitions and alliances and see that these siloed identities have a lot in common. And one of the most moving things for me was when I met Cunel Arroyo, who joined our team. And he was introduced to us by a good friend, someone with disabilities. And he said to me, Joel, it never occurred to me before that I had anything in the earth in common with transgender people, right? And it's those moments, and it's also political. It's forming activist alliances between people who never thought they had anything in common with one another. And I think what we're trying to do is by identifying those spatial commonalities and those opportunities for sharing is about engendering those forms of coalition. Okay. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the answer that we give. Anybody else? Yeah.
So I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, great lecture.
Thank you.
For doing that.
Thank you.
It has huge implications at larger scales, too, as you mentioned at the end. I have a question about how you might think of using sound as a component in this study, because I think there are really interesting opportunities with what you did, and also having to do with privacy and all these issues coming together. And I think, we can talk about it later, but I think it's an interesting addition, maybe, or you mentioned it at the end.
Yeah. Well, first of all, as some of you in the audience might know, Karen has been doing research, really significant research for years about sound in space, which is acoustics, something that we don't think about enough. And we had brief collaborations where we were able to think about that. And so, a couple of things. It's uncharted territory. All of you should download this PDF called Deaf Space, where Hansel Bauman has at least, we'll try to look at it through the lens of people who are hard of hearing. So, but really thinking about the significance of sound, or else spaces that don't have sound. In our restroom airport, that was one of the ideas. I didn't talk that much about it. I think it could be better developed, but the idea that you would move from a very kind of open, ambient, noisy concourse and increasingly go to a quieter and quieter environment. One of the ideas of that communal washing station was that the sound of water would actually not only mask like unwanted sounds, because one of the things, again, you hear all the time, I don't want to defecate next to a man because I don't want him to hear me farting. I mean, silly stuff like that. But sound is huge. By the way, I don't know if you all want to go home, but there's one, so we've been getting a lot of feedback from this, and there's one particular person who writes to us who has what is evidently, I learned, a very not uncommon kind of issue, which is the inability to pee in public space. And there's a long word for it, but I don't remember what it is. And he was very against our proposal. And when I said, well, come on, tell us, what is it? And it was the sound issue, that the critical thing for people with this condition is they don't want other people to overhear them. So we said, well, what about introducing sound masking things in this environment? And he said, okay, well, that might work. So in other words, you're like, it's the tip of the iceberg, and it's something that has a sonic dimension that you should be looking at. Yeah, you have your homework. But anyway, that we should be looking at. It's huge. And also, that's the other takeaway, that, the hope is that in the end, that we're going to create multi-sensory spaces that sound better, that look better, that are more, colorful, that have alternative forms of, yeah, you've heard of it, that it could lead to just more vital, animated, multi-sensory spaces. Yeah, that's the thought. Yeah?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Great. So I just want to say thank you. This has been really great, and I've learned a ton.
Great.
I guess I wanted to maybe comment a little bit on what was said earlier about, like, what Kyle's comment was with female bathrooms and male bathrooms.
Uh-huh.
And I think I don't know, I want to push the idea of it just being like a woman's bathroom being a social space. Like, it's definitely not just about socializing, and I think there is an element of safety imbued in that as well.
Mhm.
And also, crucially, what I thought was maybe lacking from like the list of things that you might find in the bathroom is things related to menstruation, which I didn't hear anything of in your talk. So I guess, yeah, there is actually, things imbued in a female body or sex body that I would look for, or
Right.
that I would like to see more of in your work.
Right. No, and those are very, very useful suggestions. And one of the things I've been sort of on the road talking to different groups about this, and people like you bring you really useful suggestions and say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And that is something to think about. In terms of the specific issue of menstruation, we're, for this Galatet project, that has become an important issue, and there are receptacles and places that we're sort of making within the individual stalls themselves to accommodate those needs as well as disposability and all of that. So yes. Another thing is baby changing tables is like another big issue. Someone then wrote to us and said, well, you're thinking about baby changing tables, but are you really thinking about actually for mature adults that bathrooms need to accommodate for caregivers, changing tables that accommodate adults. And so that's important, something we haven't thought about and need to think more about. And of course, the more, the bigger the net, right, the more elements that need to be introduced, and then there's a little bit of pushback from clients just about how much they're willing to incorporate. But yes, in terms of the issue of the women's room, I kind of answered that before, and I hear what you're saying. But again, I think that we can find other spaces, again, secure, safe, private spaces that could accommodate those needs. I don't know if they have to be in bathrooms. Anyway. Anybody else?
This is a super interesting talk. Actually, one of my favorite books is Alexander Kira's
Yeah.
Bathroom 11.
Uh-huh.
I talk to my students all about it. It's
Yeah.
such a beautifully sort of framework in which he speaks and how he does his work is super, super interesting. Your talk is awesome. The one thing I was kind of curious about, and not being very well read in this, but is the relationship between racism and persecution to gay or queer culture in the past. You kind of talk about them simultaneously, and yet do they share a kind of, do you feel they share a kind of common degree of persecution, or is that something that equivalence in terms of your work, or is that?
Well, first of all, that's a really, really good question. And then I think it's not about really my work. I'm really drawing from the work of others who are more qualified, which is, I wish Susan was here to answer that question. But the well-known statistic is the idea that who is victimized and unsafe in restrooms? It's trans women of color. Okay, so I mean that we know that, but I think part of what this work is about and that people are doing again is looking at the kind of intersectional relationship between race, class, gender, disability, and the way they're kind of intertwined. And I think that the kind of simple answer to that, I might have said it before, is that let's say disability studies people would sort of, well, not just that oppression, eugenics, right, have earmarked different bodies with the same argument, which is basically that they're deviant, they're abnormal, okay? And that as a consequence, they either need to be hidden, concealed, killed, eliminated, or, later reformers would say, made whole, right? And I think another argument that's very powerful that comes mostly from disability studies but could be applied, which is what's referred to as a medical model of disability, which is that through medical intervention or through architectural accommodation, we can cure the weak, the deviant, the disabled. And that same thing happens in gender, right? I mean, again, you probably read it, but, about babies who've been mutilated because their doctors needed them, to conform to these notions of normality which aren't existing. So in other words, I think that, that different, I'm not saying this very well, to be pretentious and use a Foucauldian model, different discourses like medicine, like law, like architecture have all collaborated together, right, and sometimes overt and covert ways to oppress and marginalize by differentiating people as being somehow subhuman, right? And that's a huge argument in, I'm not an expert in studies of race and the racialization of space. That justification has been that the black body, and particularly the black male body, is somehow abnormal, deviant, deranged, right, and needs accommodation. Anyway, I hope, yeah, sorry. But I don't know if that answers the question. I think when you look at these through the lens of parallel issues, you find similar forms of oppression, and architecture is sort of part of that. And I think we need to look at them together. Right? All right.
We could probably continue the discussion outside. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks very much. That's very good. Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.